Whenever I need to send roses that are guaranteed to make someone's day, the only place I trust is 1-800-Flowers.com. With 1-800-Flowers, my friends and family always receive stunning, high-quality bouquets that they absolutely love. Right now, when you buy a dozen multicolored roses, 1-800-Flowers will double your bouquet to 2 dozen roses. To claim this special double roses offer, go to 1-800-Flowers.com/Spotify. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/Spotify.
For a few years now, journalist Shoshana Walter has been obsessed with a test a lot of people get, but very few people know they're taking, unless they fail.
Yeah, obsessed is a good word.
This test is a drug test, which is often administered when folks show up at the hospital to give birth. Some hospitals test just about everyone. Others are more selective.
Maybe they drug test women or patients who did not have any prenatal care. I've heard of some hospitals electing to drug test women who come in with bad teeth. It made me really curious about the mechanisms behind how women are being identified at the hospital when they give birth and what's behind these reports. Why are they happening so often?
You can see how this testing could go wrong, right? Like maybe you test people who you just don't like for whatever reason. Maybe the test pops a false positive. Or maybe it's a real positive. Turns out that can be a problem, too.
There's multiple reasons why someone could test positive for opioids. One of the reasons is that they're taking a prescribed medication that contains opioids. That might include fentanyl they might receive in their epidurals or morphine that they might receive to help with the pain from contractions. It also could even include possibly the ingestion of poppy seeds.
The more Shoshana researched this testing, the more she came to think what hospitals and doctors thought they were giving, day in and day out, was some kind of parenting test. But what they were actually getting was something else entirely. I think some people might hear about your reporting and think, oh, well, that has nothing to do with me. This would never impact my life. What do you say to women who tell you something like that?
I mean, unfortunately, really, this type of report could happen to anyone.
Today on the show, how the United States got hooked on drug testing new moms, and why some doctors are trying to roll the practice back. I'm Mary Harris. You're listening to What Next? Stick around. Decisions made in Washington can affect your portfolio every day. But what policy changes should investors be watching? Listen to Washington Wise, an original podcast for investors from Charles Schwab, to hear the stories making news in Washington right now. Host Mike Townsend, Charles Schwab's managing director for legislative and regulatory affairs, takes a nonpartisan look at the stories that matter most to investors, including policy initiatives for retirement savings, taxes and trade, inflation concerns, the Federal Reserve, and how regulatory developments can affect companies, sectors, and even the entire market. Mike and his guests offer their perspective on how policy changes could affect what you do with your portfolio. Download the latest episode and follow at schwab.com/WashingtonWise or wherever you listen.
ID Tech, the first and most trusted tech camp, is where kids ages 7 to 17 find their people. The coding and creating people. The fire-breathing, shell-spinning BattleBots people. The just-as-happy building games as they are playing them people. At 75 prestigious college campuses all across the country, ID Tech features over 50 epic courses like BattleBots, AI and machine learning, game design, and more. Visit IDTech.com and use code IDTech to save $150 on a week that's guaranteed to be a highlight of summer.
So how did drug testing first become part of the labor experience in the United States?
Yeah, drug testing really began as a policy during childbirth during the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, when there was a real fear of quote unquote crack babies and a concern that authorities were failing to protect babies from their drug abusing mothers. And there were basically babies being boarded at the hospital because authorities were not allowing them to go home with their mothers. And so hospitals really started depending on these drug tests at that time. Fast forward years later, at the turn of the century, we're dealing with kind of this new growing opioid epidemic. Federal lawmakers passed this law that basically require hospitals in states that are receiving certain child welfare funds to notify child welfare authorities anytime a baby is born, quote unquote, substance affected by a woman's drug use.
That's so interesting because it doesn't say you have to drug test a child or a mother. It's a little vaguer than that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, every state then, passes their own laws in response to these federal requirements. But most states still to this day do not require hospitals to be doing these drug tests.
But hospitals do it maybe as a CYA move?
A CYA move?
Cover your ass?
I think that is, yeah. Hospitals are drug testing for a number of reasons. They're drug testing because they're required under their state law, likely, to notify or report to child welfare authorities when there's a suspicion of abuse or neglect or a suspicion that a mother may be using substances. And, a drug test is a super easy way to determine whether or not a baby may have been exposed to drugs. It's super easy and super fast. So, typically if a baby has been exposed to a substance in the womb that could cause withdrawal symptoms, those withdrawal symptoms are not going to even start until a few days after that baby is born. And, most hospital stays these days are super short. Families might be ready to be discharged before a baby starts exhibiting withdrawal symptoms. So there's some legitimate concern on the part of the hospital that they could miss babies who are at risk. But there's also some kind of incentive for them to report because of these mandated reporting laws. There are consequences for medical providers who do not report a suspicion of abuse or neglect. And then on the other side of that, when mandated reporters do report suspected abuse and neglect, and it turns out there was none, in many states, they're basically relieved of liability from the consequences of that. So there's real incentive to report and err on the side of caution and report rather than overlook a potential sign of abuse or neglect.
Because there's no incentive not to report.
Exactly.
How common is the testing? Because, I gave birth in New York City twice. Do you think I would have been tested?
It's definitely possible. I've heard of a lot of hospitals in New York City drug testing and reporting. Basically, hospitals across the United States are relying on these super fast, super cheap drug tests to identify potential substance exposure in newborns. And one of the major findings of my stories are that hospitals are not required to do these drug tests, but then once the drug tests are in hand, they're often required to report them. And there is no requirement that hospitals confirm those test results before reporting them to authorities.
But here's the thing with these drug tests. They can have an extremely high rate of false positives. And once a parent tests positive, hospitals are rarely bothering to confirm the results.
Say a drug test does legitimately identify a substance. It doesn't necessarily tell you that this person has an addiction that is controlling her life, or it doesn't tell you whether this person is a good or bad parent. It just tells you that this person used a substance, and it might have been one time, it might have been 5 times, it might have been 30 times. There's very limited value to these drug tests because they are so not definitive. When workplace drug testing really got going in the 80s, There was such a huge uproar from civil rights groups, from labor unions, from workers who were being fired and experiencing all these consequences due to errors with these drug tests, false positives, and misinterpreted results. And so as a result of that uproar, lawmakers built in protections for many of the workers who are drug tested. And that includes a second, more definitive confirmation test and a review from a specially trained doctor who can differentiate, for example, between a positive test caused by poppy seeds versus a positive test caused by heroin or illicit drugs. And despite the fact that drug testing at labor and delivery is so incredibly common and has been for decades, there's not a single state that provides those protections to birthing patients and their newborns.
So it seems like all of these incentives put a lot of power in the hands of whoever decides who needs to be tested at a specific hospital. Like a hospital may have a blanket policy, everyone's tested, but it sounds like in some hospitals, maybe a lot of hospitals, it's just kind of a decision of someone on the ward looking around, making a call.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke with providers who said that piercings, tattoos, that could trigger a drug test. I mean, I think this leaves a lot of women vulnerable to possibly being judged and drug tested as a result of that.
And then, once a family is facing a positive result, their case could get referred to Child Protective Services for investigation. The family can lose a newborn. Fighting back is difficult, expensive.
Families who can afford it will hire their own attorneys, and that can run in the thousands and thousands of dollars. Also, the best form of defense in some of these cases has been for families to present their own drug test evidence. So that is an additional expense on top of that. And then, a lot of the women that I talked to, particularly the ones with the worst consequences, did not have money to hire their own attorneys or to get their own drug tests, or didn't even know what they might need to effectively advocate for themselves. So in those instances, the only way to kind of get through it for those parents has been to literally go through the process of a child welfare case, which is a very intrusive and stressful experience where child welfare investigators will come into your home, look at every aspect of your life, interview your other children, interview your family members and friends. Maybe they'll require regular drug testing. In some of these cases, women actually had their newborns taken from them and placed in foster care with family. In other cases, like a couple in South Carolina whose positive test was due to a poppy seed muffin, they literally were not allowed to be alone with their children for the first 45 days of their newborn's life. And in that instance, the child welfare worker had even written in their records, that the report could be falsified and that poppy seeds were involved. So even in instances where the child welfare agency itself is kind of unsure about what caused the positive drug test, there's still this forward motion after a child welfare report has been made, where for most of the parties involved, the only way to get through it is to literally just go through it.
Part of what's so striking about your reporting is the evidence that the doctors involved in administering these tests and the agencies involved in relying on these tests to accuse women of endangering their kids, they really should have known better. Like, in one case, you detail how in the records of the mother and the child, a medication is listed, like, the mother is given this medication. It says this medication may turn up in the child afterwards. Like it says right there, like this could happen.
Yeah.
And yet that is why the woman was accused of potentially harming her kid. I think that's really one of the things I took away from your reporting, that there are so many places along the way where people just should have known more.
Absolutely. I mean, every drug test result that I've reviewed, and I've reviewed thousands and thousands of pages of medical records at this point, every single one of those drug tests says something along the lines of, these results should not be used for criminal legal purposes. These results have not been confirmed. So even in these medical records, there's an acknowledgement that these test results are not much better than guesses as to what might be in someone's system. The potential consequences of these tests are so severe, birthing women should receive more definitive test results. They should receive more protections from the consequences of these tests.
And yet they don't.
And yet they don't.
We'll be right back. This episode is brought to you by Discover. It's smart to always have a few financial goals. And here's a really smart one you can set: earning cash back on what you buy every day. With Discover, you can. Get this. Discover automatically matches all the cash back you've earned at the end of your first year. Seriously, all of it. Discover trusts you to make smart decisions. After all, you listen to this podcast. See terms at discover.com/creditcard.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. It's tax season, and we're all a bit tired of numbers. But here's one you need to hear. $16.5 billion. That's how much the IRS flagged for possible identity fraud last year. Now here's a good number. 100 million. That's how many data points LifeLock monitors every second. If your identity is stolen, they'll fix it. Guaranteed. Save up to 40% your first year at LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
You may get a little excited when you shop at Burlington.
What a low price! Did you see that? They have my favorite brand! It's like a whole new Burlington! I can buy two! Woo!
I'm saving so much! Yeah!
Burlington saves you up to 60% off other retailers' prices every day. Will it be the low prices or the great brands? You'll love the deals. You'll love Burlington. I told you so.
I'm wondering if you can tell me the story of Susan Horton, because her story is extreme in this way that I think will really shock my listeners. She's been a stay-at-home mom for a couple decades. She was pregnant with her 5th child, so really felt like she knew what she was doing when she showed up at the hospital. What happened to her?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Susan is a very experienced mom and kind of like trusts herself to know how to take care of her body, how to best take care of her family. And she has 2 members of her family who are immunocompromised. So this was during COVID times. She tried to avoid the doctor whenever she could. So during her pregnancy, she went to the most important prenatal appointments. You know, she went to her ultrasounds. She monitored her own blood pressure at home, and she just tried to avoid the doctor when she could.
Was that kind of a red flag for physicians for her? Like, oh, she's not coming in for her appointments.
Yes. I mean, I later learned that the hospital that Susan delivered at, their policy is to drug test every single birthing patient. So that wouldn't have made a difference in whether or not they drug tested Susan, but it was a detail that they later reported to child welfare authorities as a, potential sign that Susan had not done everything she was supposed to do as someone giving birth. So the night before she went into the hospital to give birth, she started feeling the contractions. She started monitoring the contractions, and she basically put together the easiest, simplest meal she could manage for her family, which was frozen pizza and a salad kit from Costco with poppy seed dressing. And she ate that. The next day, she went into the hospital to give birth. She was drug tested, and she gave birth to her daughter, very healthy, 10-pound baby. And not too long after that, someone came into her room and told her that she had tested positive for opiates.
How did she respond?
She was totally puzzled. She was she was kind of in disbelief, and she told them she had no idea why that would be.
So what happened with her child?
So Kaiser reported Susan to child welfare authorities. There's conversations between child welfare authorities and the hospital where, the hospital's basically saying, well, it could be poppy seeds, could not be poppy seeds. We just have no way of knowing. There are more definitive tests that the hospital could do to determine that, but that wasn't discussed at all. And child welfare authorities got an order to remove Susan's newborn from her care. And her baby was not allowed to come home with them and basically stayed out of their care for 2 weeks until a judge dismissed the case.
You're making a pretty good case for why using these tests in the maternity ward is problematic. But I'm wondering if you can give me a counterexample, or if in your reporting you encountered people who offered counterexamples. Like I'm thinking of, a woman who maybe no one knew was struggling with addiction, who, had a positive drug test, had their child taken away, and they were able to make different choices, eventually maybe have their child back. It worked out well.
Yeah. I mean, I've talked with a lot of child welfare workers and also medical providers who are really concerned about leaving children in the hands of providers who are a risk to them. And what I can say is that when a newborn has been exposed to drugs in the womb and they're experiencing withdrawal symptoms from no longer being exposed to those substances, what research has shown is best for that newborn is actually to remain with their mother. This is a method that is called Eat, Sleep, and Console, and it's literally just skin-to-skin contact with mother, breastfeeding, and consoling by the mother of their newborn. Studies have also shown that mothers who are struggling with substance use disorder do better as well when they remain with their children. Treatment programs that allow mothers to stay with their kids have shown far greater rates of success. And so there are strategies for treating these types of families that are known to improve outcomes for both mothers and babies. But unfortunately, the number of these programs, I learned in my reporting, has actually steadily declined since the start of the opioid epidemic. So there's fewer opportunities for mothers to stay with their babies when they're reported to child welfare authorities.
There isn't clear data about how many pregnant patients are being tested annually, or how often these tests lead to a baby being taken away. But Shoshana found that in 2022 alone, more than 35,000 drug tests were being reported to child welfare agencies. And in the end, authorities removed more than 6,000 infants. Some hospitals are trying to replace drug tests now with a screening questionnaire asking about drug use. But answering a questionnaire like that honestly requires a whole lot of trust. It means getting people struggling with addiction to be honest about the challenges they're facing so doctors can get them into treatment. It isn't easy, especially in a medical system that rarely allows doctors the kind of time to build that trust. But Shoshana says preliminary results from these new policies seem promising.
At Yale New Haven Hospital in Connecticut, they changed their policies the past few years to get rid of automatic drug testing of newborns and their parents. And what they found is that reports to child welfare authorities out of their newborn nursery declined by 50%. But at the same time, they did not see any cases where newborns came back in at a later point with untreated withdrawal symptoms or complications due to their provider's drug use.
Huh. I guess they could have gone to another hospital, potentially.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this data is still very preliminary. And so, it needs really a full study. All these policies are still so new. So it's really hard to tell for sure what the impact of the policies are. But at least so far, this hospital has managed to decrease the number of reports they're making to child welfare authorities without consequences to their recurring patients.
Can we talk about the women you spoke to? Because I know you spoke to so many of them.
Yeah.
I wonder, after they have these difficult experiences with the hospital and child welfare agencies, where it leaves them.
That's such a good question. Being accused of drug use and being told that you've hurt your baby, even if it's not true, it causes such shame and humiliation and fear. And then being subjected to a child welfare investigation or removal, it just undermines a person's sense of confidence in themselves as mothers. This is something that Susan Horton and I spoke a lot about. Just even after it was all resolved, she just continues to question everything she does as a parent and as a mother, for fear that someone may come into her home, accuse her of being a bad mom, and take her children away again. And so for some of these women, speaking out and telling their stories on their terms helped them regain that feeling of power and control over their own lives. But I think the impact of these reports will be felt by them for a long, long, long time.
Shoshana, I'm really grateful for your time. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Mary.
Shoshana Walter is a staff writer for the Marshall Project. She works on investigations. And that's our show. What Next is produced by Paige Osburn, Elena Schwartz, Rob Gunther, Madeline Ducharme, and Anna Phillips. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations here at Slate. And I'm Mary Harris. You can go track me down on Blue Sky if you'd like. I'm at Mary Harris. Thanks for listening. I'll catch you back here next time.